Hello and welcome to Generation 16, the series that showcases the history of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Seward. In this episode, we kick off 1991 with one of the most unique arcade shooters ever to come out of Sega. It's time to take a look at Gain Ground. In 1985, Sega R&D 1 planner Makoto Oshitani was readying a follow-up to his first game, Ninja Princess. This overhead shooter is probably most notable for being one of, if not the first, arcade game to feature a human female protagonist in the form of Princess Kuruni. Princess Kuruni was designed by none other than Rieko Kodama, who was just beginning her stellar career at Sega. But the female protagonist wasn't the only reason Ninja Princess was special. The game also featured a player-controlled camera rather than a forced scrolling setup, the ability to fire in 8 directions, and levels which scrolled vertically, diagonally, and horizontally. Being able to shoot in all 8 directions made Princess Kuruni quite versatile, but it was the addition of an alternate fire button where she would throw a star straight up the screen no matter which way she was facing that made Ninja Princess so much fun to play, in my opinion. Ninja Princess was a modest hit for Sega, listed as the most successful table arcade unit in Japan in the May 1985 issue of Game Machine Magazine. It would see worldwide distribution both in arcades and through home ports for the SG-1000, Master System, and MSX Computer, though the Master System version featured a male protagonist and Princess Kuruni was demoted to a damsel in distress. Around the same time Japanese gamers were saving Princess Kuruni's kingdom, another game was taking the Western arcades by storm. Atari's Gauntlet was a huge hit seemingly from the moment it was released, raking in massive amounts of quarters for arcade operators in the US and Canada. In 1986, Namco distributed the game to Japanese arcades with similar success. In both regions, Gauntlet was one of the highest grossing machines that year, going toe-to-toe with Sega's Hang-On and Space Harrier and Namco's own Pole Position 2. Heavily inspired by Konami's Tutankhamun and John Howard Pavlik's Dandy, Gauntlet's real claim to fame was the ability for 4 players to gather around a single arcade machine and take on legions of ghosts, demons, sorcerers, and more as they raced to the end of each level trying to collect treasure and food. Depending on which coin slot they dropped their quarter into, players would take on the role of a warrior, wizard, Valkyrie, or elf, each with very different fighting abilities. It was Dungeons & Dragons in arcade form. Sega R&D 1's next game would attempt to capitalize on this Gauntlet mania. Using the brand new higher resolution System 24 board, it would create a multiplayer overhead shooter similar to Atari's masterpiece. This was the starting point for the Gain Ground development team, though the game very quickly diverged from anything one could really call a Gauntlet clone. In an interview for 2003's Sega Masterpiece album series, programmer Yoshiki Ooka stated that while Gain Ground did feature different character types, just like Gauntlet, the player would be able to choose freely between them rather than being assigned based on their physical position at the controls. Further moving away from Gauntlet, the team at Sega intended to draw on game mechanics from one of their previous shooters. We took the shop system from the arcade game Fantasy Zone. Gauntlet was about physical combat and Gain Ground was about shooting. In the initial designs, collecting money was more important than fighting enemies. You were able to buy and sell players at a place called Mercenary Corner. As development progressed, however, Mercenary Corner was dropped. Without at least a little control over when and where players would have access to specific characters and their abilities, Gain Ground would just be too hard to balance. After a lengthy development cycle, Gain Ground finally hit arcades in November of 1988 and didn't seem to make any sort of impact. Not surprising, really. Arcade games are usually all about that immediate gratification, exciting from the start, intense action, easy to understand controls and processes. Gameground doesn't really tick any of those boxes. As Uoka admitted in that same interview, "We made a game that turned off first-time players because the game only really picks up after round 1, in the middle of round 2. The game starts to shine from round 3 and onward, after you've cleared about 20 screens." What you just heard was the game's programmer essentially admitting that you need to get nearly halfway into Gain Ground before it really gets exciting. Things weren't looking good for Gain Ground. And then Koji Kendou began praising the game in the pages of Micom BASIC Magazine, a well-respected gaming and programming periodical that had been running since 1982. "This is amazing. While it's a game for enthusiasts, it's absolutely a masterpiece. It has a very strong strategic element to it. It's irresistible to players that want to focus and have fun learning all of the tricks. If Gain Ground is released on the Mega Drive, I'm definitely going to buy one. I pinky swear on it." Yoshiki Uoka said that without people like Kendou supporting it, Gain Ground would not have been as appreciated as it eventually was. While other magazines at the time were covering Gain Ground like a traditional single-player shooter, Kendou and Micom BASIC illustrated the game's depth to the public, with detailed strategies. According to the arcade game Flyer, a long period of peace has deprived the Earthlings of their instinct to wage war. The Federated government, greatly concerned regarding this ever-increasing dangerous situation, developed the Gain Ground simulation system in the year 2348 in an effort to instigate their ever-waning fighting spirit. However, suddenly without warning, the supercomputer went berserk and took many of the citizens as hostages. In order to rescue the POWs, 3 of the bravest warriors were urgently dispatched to go forth into the deadly Gain Ground. Upon starting the game, you choose to play as one of these 3 bravest warriors, each with their own unique abilities. Ashura can throw his spear in 8 directions, as well as lobbing it to higher levels with his alternate attack. Betty fires a handgun in all directions and lobs grenades straight up the screen with her alternate attack. Finally, Johnny fires his rifle in every direction or can strafe, shooting straight up the screen at a very long range with his alternate attack. In fact, Johnny's attack options feel really similar to Princess Karuni's in the previously mentioned Ninja Princess. Each player has all 3 characters to start with and can choose to control whomever they please. Although Gain Ground is technically a shooter, it actually plays more like a shooter-puzzler hybrid. Each level features very specific enemy layouts and behaviors. You complete each screen in one of 2 ways, either by destroying every enemy on the level, or by walking every one of your heroes to the exit before time runs out. But here's the catch. Every now and then you'll see a small character icon on the field. This is another playable hero that must be rescued in order to join the group. But the only way to do that is to grab them on the field and then carry them to the exit. Now they're playable. If you or one of your partners happens to destroy every enemy in a level before these characters are rescued, you miss your opportunity and are forced to move on to the next screen without your potential new ally. Oh, and only one player can collect the stranded characters, unless you're good enough to take advantage of a bug where collecting a character simultaneously yields a new fighter for both players. You'll want to rescue as many new characters as you can, since they all have unique and sometimes very powerful abilities. Plus, they basically act as extra lives. As long as you have at least one surviving character in your roster, your game won't end. With 20 different characters in Gain Ground and the ability to carry duplicates, your army can get pretty big. It's a beautifully strange premise that really makes Gain Ground a standout experience. Like programmer Uoka said, it's almost impossible to see the potential in the game when you first pick it up. I can't imagine dropping more than a single quarter in this thing back in the late 80s, when it was surrounded by other, more exciting games that all promised immediate gratification. When everything finally clicks, though, you realize that a wonderful risk-reward system lies at the heart of Gain Ground. By shoring up your army with more and more members, you automatically make later levels both easier and potentially more difficult if you want to continue building your reserves. You'll also want to play over and over again so you can familiarize yourself with the fighters whose abilities complement your playstyle, as well as the specific challenges in each level. Oh, and you'll need to remember where to find those soldiers as well. So, which similarities does Gain Ground ultimately share with its inspiration, Gauntlet? Well, much like the Atari game, each level comes with a time limit. In Gain Ground, you have a discrete timer counting down on screen, whereas in Gauntlet, the timer serves double duty as a health bar and can be replenished with food items. In Gain Ground, each playable character has a specific set of abilities just like Gauntlet, but where Gauntlet only has 4 characters, Gain Ground features 20, though they can mostly be grouped into specific types based on their fighting styles. Even within groups of similar characters, some are faster than others, and there are a wide variety of projectile speeds and special abilities. Unlike Gauntlet's 4-player gameplay, Gain Ground only supports up to 3 players. Here's a fun fact. In Japan, Gain Ground was released as a 2-player game, as each new game getting its own dedicated cabinet was pretty uncommon, most arcades being full of multi-purpose or candy cabinets like the Sega Aero City or Taito Egret series, where game boards were swapped out when new titles were released. Sega's System 24 board was partially designed around the idea of making game swaps just a bit easier by including small boards and floppy disks for each subsequent game. Meanwhile, in Western markets, dedicated cabinets were far more prevalent, though conversion kits where operators could put new games in older cabinets were becoming more common. Sega had some experience with multiplayer cabinets featuring more than 2 controllers with its 1986 release, Quartet, which allowed up to 4 players on the same machine. So unlike in the Japanese game, the Western version of Gain Ground ended up supporting 3 players. The 2- and 3-player versions were actually different physical boards and floppy disks, not just different dip switch settings. Okay, let's pump the brakes for a second and talk about Quartet. While Gauntlet is largely and rightly credited for the rise in popularity of 3- and 4-player games in the arcades, it wasn't alone. Atari itself released 3-player racing game Super Sprint in 1986, Bally Midway released the 3-player Rampage, and Sega released the 4-player Quartet just months after Gauntlet came on the scene. It was an exciting time in arcades, and for the most part these 3- and 4-player games offered a wonderful sense of risk and reward where working together was often the only way to really progress, but you were still competing for the highest score amongst your friends. Plus, with the option to buy into an existing game if a spot opened up, you didn't have to stand around and wait for the machines to completely free up before dropping in your quarter. In the aptly named Quartet, players controlled one of 4 different characters as they tried to shoot their way through 32 levels of robot-controlled, side-scrolling action. One enemy in each level held the key to unlock the door and move on. Much like Gauntlet, players were working against the timer in Quartet, which also happened to double as their life bar, and each level was populated with monster generators that would constantly spawn enemies. Each of the 4 characters, Lee, Joe, Mary, and Edgar, had slightly different weapons as well. This was clearly a Gauntlet clone. Quartet was a success for Sega. In Japan, it was listed in Game Machine as one of the most successful games in May of 1986. The August 15, 1986 issue of Playmeter magazine listed Quartet as the top earner in the United States that week, beating out the likes of Ikari Warriors, Hang-On, Paperboy, and, yes, even Gauntlet. Cashbox magazine even name-checked Quartet in its 1986 Arcade Year in Review, crediting Sega's shooter alongside Gauntlet and Rampage for revitalizing the multiplayer game and bringing lapsed players back to the arcade in increasing numbers that year. But Quartet wasn't necessarily a further influence on Gain Ground. While it was successful, Gauntlet was still considered the gold standard for multiplayer gaming in arcades in 1986. More likely, Gain Ground was simply the answer to a call by Sega's sales or marketing team for a 2- or 3-player action game on the relatively new System 24 arcade hardware. Alright, back to the subject of this video. The 2 most fundamental differences between Gauntlet and Gain Ground, in my opinion, are the latter's single-screen levels and the enemy AI. In Gauntlet, the challenge lies in finding your way to the exit of each level within a time limit and surviving a potentially endless onslaught of monsters while you do it. When monsters appear, they make a beeline for the closest hero unless their path is blocked by a wall or another enemy sprite. Although scrolling levels were considered by the Gain Ground team, they were dropped early on. Scrolling games are hard to play in multiplayer. For example, when one player is in the back doing his best, but the others move forward and force the screen to scroll, in the end, not all players can move freely. Gainground is also a much more tactical game than Gauntlet. Every level fits on a single screen, so all 3 players have full freedom of movement. Most, but not all enemies, are visible on screen from the start, but won't begin attacking until certain criteria are met. Usually this is triggered by a hero moving to a predetermined point on the screen. While there are no monster generators, enemies can spawn off-screen and walk in when needed. This can be a bit surprising the first time it happens, though Gainground does feature an enemy counter on the top right of the screen, so players can discern pretty easily whether to expect new foes to appear as they progress. This enemy behavior was based on meticulous records of playtesting and endless fiddling to get things working just right. Uoka essentially created heat maps for each level while watching the testers play the game, a pretty forward-thinking idea that's regularly employed today using off-the-shelf software. It took a lot of trial and error to find out how to write a general AI routine that could be adjusted for different situations. For example, if there's an obstacle, the enemy has to approach the player while avoiding it. If 2 enemies are attacking the same player character, you have to figure out how to avoid a pileup. I had to do these things many times. It took me 1 year and 3 months to finish it. Today that would be inexcusable, but since this was my first programming job, the others were quite generous. This slow progress eventually caught up with the team as they were given a shipping deadline and had to send Gainground out into the wild in an incomplete form. Gainground in arcades ended up being a shorter game than planned. As well, due to the hectic end of development cycle, it shipped with a few bugs. One of those bugs in particular has gained infamy. In the original Japanese version of Gainground, players were faced with a dastardly bug on level 4-8. There are 8 turrets in this stage, but when they are destroyed, the enemy counter in the level doesn't decrease. Thus, the only option players have in 4-8 is to run as many of their heroes as possible to the exit before time runs out. And these turrets are nasty, so they generally need to be disposed of just to get to the exit at all. Yoshiki Uoka claims this bug was actually fixed before ship, but the team somehow forgot to include the update in the version that went out the door. The 3-player version of Gainground released in North America contained a fix, though it was more of a hack. In this version, the enemy counter was simply reduced so that the turrets weren't required for completion. It actually makes one of the final levels in the game kind of ridiculously easy. In the Japanese revision of the game, the enemy counter was fixed properly to count down as the turrets were destroyed, but Uoka claimed that people didn't seem to mind the issue, so Sega never bothered to update versions of Gainground which were already in arcades. The multiplayer gameplay is definitely the main attraction in Gainground. When I spoke to Uoka for this episode, he repeatedly asked that I enjoy the game with multiple people rather than alone. And he's right. As a single-player game, Gainground is just decent. But it comes alive when you play with more people. I recruited a player 2 and 3 for this video, and what started as playing just a few minutes in order to capture footage turned into a lengthy run through dozens of levels. It was really a lot of fun. The action in Gainground is slow and plodding. You can tackle each level by running in, guns blazing, but to see real success you want to pair your lightning-quick reflexes with meticulous planning. Most of your heroes are on the slow side, and many of their special attacks are quite deliberate. Assessing the layout of each level, or memorizing enemy movements through multiple play sessions, and matching a hero's unique abilities to each challenge is the main path to success. Unlike in Gauntlet, where spawned enemies make a beeline for the players the second they're on screen, Gainground's bad guys hold station until they're triggered. Learning what activates certain groups or causes new enemies to enter the stage from predetermined locations is key. This is further emphasized by heroes who need to be rescued. Often, they're located behind a group of enemies. You'll spend a lot of time figuring out which ones you have to kill versus which ones to keep alive so that the current level doesn't end prematurely. Bringing Gainground to Sega's home consoles fell to longtime Sega collaborator Sanritsu, which had previously ported Tetris and Tongue of the Fat Man to the Mega Drive, as well as a long list of games for the Master System. concessions always needed to be made when bringing the arcade home, and Gain Ground was no exception. As of early 1991, there was no way for 3 players to play together on the Mega Drive, and so the home console port of the game would resemble the 2-player Japanese version of Gain Ground rather than the 3-player version found mostly overseas. The other obvious hurdle was the tall aspect ratio Gain Ground shared with so many other vertical shooters in the arcades. Here, Sanritsu went with the tried-and-true pillar box idea, maintaining a proper relative screen ratio for the most part by moving all of the HUD elements to either side of the playfield. Actually, in a 2-player game like Gain Ground, where character selection is a key mechanic, I think this approach works even better than it previously had on more traditional shooters for the Mega Drive. The larger character portraits and ability icons read fine even in the lower resolution offered by the 16-bit console. Just as with the arcade original, Gain Ground on the Mega Drive is only a decent single-player game, but really shines when you bring along a friend. The gameplay here feels really authentic. Sanritsu managed to recreate the quirkiness of the source material, even paying attention to things like each hero firing with their dominant hands. And while some of the special weapons feel a bit different, especially those which you can lob to take out enemies at higher elevations, for the most part the cartridge feels identical to the coin-op. Gain Ground on the Mega Drive could be considered a bit of a director's cut as well, or at least a fully complete version of the game. In the Sega Masterpiece Series interview, developer Yoshiki Uoka discussed how the arcade version of Gain Ground was supposed to be a lot longer. In the beginning, we planned to have 50 to 60 screens in the arcade version, but because I was working too slowly, we had to omit the present-day level. The designers only had 3 stages of the present-day era ready, and the enemies weren't set up yet, so we just got the order to scrap it and leave the game with 40 stages. Those 10 present-day levels ultimately made it into the Mega Drive game, so, as Uoka pointed out in the interview, it could be considered the true version of Gain Ground. Present Day becomes Stage 4 in the Mega Drive cartridge, pushing the future levels that ended the arcade game back to Stage 5. Oh, and if you were wondering, that 4.8 bug, now 5.8 on the home version, was fixed for the Mega Drive game. Sanritsu also included difficulty options on the Mega Drive. Playing in hard mode is a bit misleading, as it fills your roster with all 20 characters right from the start. However, there are no heroes to be found and rescued in hard mode, so once you've burned through your entire army, the game is over. Still, it's a really interesting twist on the play mechanic that made the Mega Drive version of Gain Ground the most fully featured home port of the game back in the early 90s. Gain Ground was the second System 24 game to be ported to the Mega Drive, and the second one left stranded in Japan by Sega. Like Crackdown before it, Gain Ground would come to Western shores via a third-party publisher. This time, Renovation Products stepped up. While Crackdown had been turned down by Sega because it really wasn't happy with the quality of the home port, I have trouble believing that was the case with Gain Ground, but who knows? The US version hit in May of 1991, only 4 months after the original Japanese launch. Renovation was riding a wave of big releases at this point, with Whip Rush, Final Zone, Arrow Flash, and the mighty Gaiares all coming out in the previous 6 months. In spite of that, though, it doesn't appear Gain Ground made much of an impression when it was released in North America. I'm sure the ads, which lacked even a single screenshot, didn't help the situation. Perhaps, like the arcade original before it, this Genesis port needed someone in the media to champion the game and help reveal its otherwise hidden depth. And that's a shame, because the quality is there. Sanritsu managed to capture the feel of the Gain Ground coin-op almost perfectly in the Genesis version. The visuals are definitely a downgrade, but it's still pretty pleasant to look at. The music gets the job done as well, but the gameplay is just about spot on. Sanritsu also developed a Master System version of Gain Ground, which never made it to North American shores but did manage to see a release in Europe, Australia, the UK, and Brazil. The Master System game is pretty solid, though it's way more about capturing the spirit of the original than recreating what was found in arcades. Most of the levels here have been simplified and are not carbon copies of the original layouts. Heroes can still be rescued on the field, though they're represented by weapon icons rather than miniature character sprites. There's a good reason for this limitation. In Gain Ground on the Master System, the 20 different characters have been reduced to male and female counterparts of 10 different character types. spear fighters, rifle infantry, grenadiers, archers, ninjas, boomerang throwers, flamethrowers, water wizards, missile launchers, and cluster missile launchers. Whether you play as the male or female hero from each category depends on whether you're player 1 or player 2. Men for player 1, women for player 2. The finer differences between characters aren't included in the Master System version, as the male and female representatives of each type play exactly the same, while in the arcade and on the Mega Drive, most heroes generally had more subtle differences than just their weapon types, especially when it came to walking speed. Like the Genesis, the Master System version of Gain Ground also features 10 extra levels over and above what was seen in the arcades. On the Master System, however, these are a completely unique set of levels that are tacked on after the original game's final chapter, based on what is called the Final Era. Though it would release a few more Master System games, Gain Ground marks the third and final appearance of developer Sanritsu on the Mega Drive. In June of 1991, it would begin a joint venture with Sega itself and be rebranded as Sims Company. Sims would go on to release dozens of games across every Sega platform, ultimately branching out when Sega went third-party in 2001. Before we move on, there's one other contemporary port of Gain Ground to talk about. It would grace the NEC PC Engine Super CD ROM system at the end of 1992. Developer Fill-In Cafe took a different approach than Sanritsu when bringing Gain Ground to Japanese living rooms. Rather than maintaining the all-important multiplayer gameplay, Gain Ground on PC Engine is a single-player game. And where the Mega Drive version attempted to maintain the tall screen ratio found in the coin-op, Fill-In Cafe opted to zoom in on the action and use vertical scrolling to keep each level as authentic as possible. These two decisions result in a game that feels pretty different overall than the original arcade game. Knowing where most of your enemies are in a given level is an important bit of information in Gain Ground, so not being able to see the top of each screen when you first start a new level is a definite disadvantage. But, to its credit, Fill-In Cafe made Gain Ground on the PC Engine a tad easier than its Mega Drive and Master System counterparts, so in spite of the zoomed-in action, off-screen enemies, and lack of multiplayer, this version of the game is extremely playable as well. Not to mention it features a fantastic Red Book audio soundtrack with arranged versions of the original compositions. At the 1993 Winter CES, Turbo Technologies, which had replaced NEC Technologies as stewards of the TurboGrafx 16 in North America, demonstrated a US version of Gain Ground, but it was ultimately cancelled. Still, considering Gain Ground could safely be called a cult hit at best in arcades, it's pretty cool that three very authentic yet decidedly different versions of the game came home to three different consoles within a few years of its release. Like a lot of Sega's classic arcade fare, Gain Ground's run didn't come to an end after initial ports to contemporary consoles of the time. In fact, due to its cult classic status, it somehow found its way into the Sega Ages 2500 series on the PlayStation 2. This was a collection of budget-priced, mostly 3D remakes of classic Sega arcade games released in Japan in the mid-2000s. You may remember this Sega Classics collection, which was released in the West by Sega and Europe by Conspiracy Entertainment. It featured some pretty awful 3D reimaginings of stuff like Space Harrier, Golden Axe, and Outrun. Those were originally Sega Ages 2500 releases. Anyway, Gain Ground was featured in Volume 9 of the 2500 series. Developed by M2 and featuring the same low-budget visuals the series became infamous for, this is yet another new take on the classic shooter. It can be played by up to two players from either an overhead perspective or at a 45-degree angle, which at least takes advantage of the 3D visuals. Still, the PlayStation 2 version of Gain Ground plays like the original, and features a really great option, the ability to play level 4-8 with or without the enemy counter bug found in the first run of the arcade machine. According to Sega during that 2003 interview with Yoshiki Uoka, apparently many players believe that the inability to finish level 4-8 by destroying all enemies was a deliberate design choice, and therefore consider it true to the original vision of the game. So of course, M2 gave players the option to turn the bug on or off when it released the 2500 version in 2006. Between the PlayStation 2 release and the release of this video in 2024, Gameground would be released through multiple compilations and downloads across 13 different platforms, including on mobile phones, Sega's Astro City Mini, and most recently, as of this year, on the Sega Mega Drive Mini 2. And while almost all of them were simply emulators running the original arcade or Mega Drive ROMs, there were a couple of releases that were more than simple emulation. Throughout the early 2000s, Sega and its various development teams offered a slew of different gaming services for mobile platforms. As 2010 approached, most of them ended up merging into a service called Puyo Puyo Sega, which offered games and game-related items like wallpapers and ringtones for Android, Docomo, Y-Mobile, and other phones. In 2010, Gameground again arrived on Puyo Puyo Sega. Rather than a straight port of the arcade or Mega Drive game, Gameground again was actually a sequel. The gameplay was largely the same, a strategic overhead shooter where levels could be completed in two different ways, though the playable heroes seem to be totally original characters with primary and secondary weapons that feel quite different to those found in the first game. Players would still begin with 3 heroes and would have to get through various levels of a wargame simulation that had run amok. Along the way, they could rescue captured heroes to increase their numbers. However, rather than selecting a character from your roster and being stuck with them until you either complete or escape the level, or they die, in Gameground again, players could switch between different heroes on the fly. And no matter how many heroes they rescued, their roster was always capped at 3. Rescued characters would become available for the 3-person crew at the beginning of subsequent games. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to play Gameground again for this episode, but from watching the video it looks like it was an interesting take on the classic formula, complete with upgraded graphics and a pretty decent soundtrack. There's one more Gameground release that's worth talking about. When I spoke to programmer Yoshiki Iooka for this episode, he insisted on 2 things. Be sure to play Gameground as a multiplayer game, as he feels the communication between players is a hugely important part of the experience, and if you do, play it on the Nintendo Switch, as, in his opinion, it comes the closest to reproducing the original coin-ops tech. The Switch version of Gameground was released as part of the criminally short-lived Sega Ages series on the system, developed, naturally, by M2. The Sega Ages Switch series features a wonderfully diverse group of games, so Gameground doesn't feel out of place at all amongst other cult classics like Herzog 2 or Ichidant R. But even with such an eclectic mix, Japanese gaming site GameWatch still felt the need to ask why Sega and M2 would consider recreating Gameground when it interviewed the team in 2018. The response was really interesting. Back in 2014, Sega and M2 collaborated on a series of Sega 3D compilations for the Nintendo 3DS. Called the Sega 3D Fukoku Akabusu, it was a series of 3 compilations. The second of the 3 was released in the West as the Sega 3D Classics Collection, while a lot of the individual games were released as downloadable titles under the Sega 3D Classics umbrella. When Volume 3 was being planned, Sega and M2 asked the public to decide which classics they'd like to see included on the final cartridge via an online poll. At the 2016 Tokyo Game Show, they revealed the results of the poll as well as the final games to be included during their stage show, and while Gameground didn't make the final cut, it did come in 4th on that poll, ahead of such classics as Space Harrier 2, Super Monaco GP, and the Thunder Force series. It proved that the algorithmic shooter still had a large, loyal following that was eager to play the game again. The team at M2 were fans of Gameground anyway, and the fact that it performed so well in that 2016 poll was not forgotten when it was time to start releasing Sega Ages titles on the Nintendo Switch. Finally, they had a system powerful enough to properly emulate the System 24 arcade hardware. As with other games in the series, Gain Ground on the Switch features both the 2-player Japanese and 3-player North American versions of the arcade game, complete with the option to turn that 4.8 bug back on again. M2 also lifted the hard mode from the original Genesis port, offering a mode in the Japanese version where you start with all 20 warriors on your roster, though none can be rescued as you work your way through the game. Gain Ground on the Nintendo Switch served an even greater purpose, though. In the 2018 interview with Game Watch, the developers pointed out that this was their first attempt at emulating the Sega System 24 arcade hardware. M2 founder Naoki Hori stated, "Aspects of the System 24's architecture were actually the same as the Model 1. So in that way, the System 24 was a step on the path toward virtual racing. So I wanted to go all in on the System 24." Supervisor Yosuke Okanari stated that M2 had been on a mission to conquer Sega's hardware one by one for the past decade or so, and Model 1 was a major milestone. So if you, like me, were super excited to get an arcade-perfect version of virtual racing on your Nintendo Switch back in 2019, you can thank Gain Ground. Since I started this series, one of my greatest joys has been discovering great games that have been sitting in plain sight for 30 years. When I think of Sega arcade classics, I always go directly to superscalar games like Outrun and Space Harrier and Afterburner. For years, I turned up my nose at games like Flicky and Gain Ground. How good could they be? I never saw either of them in the arcades of my youth. But much like my experience learning about Flicky, I've kind of fallen in love with Gain Ground. What was supposed to be a simple Gauntlet clone became one of the most unique and interesting multiplayer shooters I've ever played, and pretty timeless to boot. If you have the ability to fire up the Switch version and play through with a couple of friends, I highly recommend doing so. Heck, the Genesis version is loads of fun with a pal as well. I found a new game to add to my list of favorites. And that'll do it for this episode of Generation 16. Thanks for watching. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Yoshiki Uoka for generously answering all of my questions and offering a whole lot more insight than I expected. If you liked what you saw, please like and subscribe, and please consider supporting the show on Patreon. Join me next time as I explore the library of adult Mega LD games on the Pioneer Laser Active. See you then.